Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Appreciate you joining us this morning here. My name is Toby Bruin. I'm the CEO of Foundations Community Partnership, and with me this morning is also my colleague, Caroline O'Connell-Sinton, who is our Director of Grants and Programs. So for those of you who don't know that much about FCP, just a quick overview of what we do. We're a private grant-making foundation supporting the behavioral health and human service needs of children, young adults, and families in Bucks County. And we do this through grants to nonprofit organizations, awarding scholarship to high school seniors, subsidizing service learning opportunities for college students, and underwriting professional development programs, just like we do this morning. I'm going to ask Caroline to quickly share with you a little bit more about our grant opportunities in case you are interested. And before we start this morning's conversation, and for that, I'm also going to share quickly my screen here. Caroline, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all here. As Toby said, I'm Caroline. I'm the Director of Grants and Programs here at FCP. And to learn more about FCP's grant programs, the first and best place to learn more about each type of grant that we provide is the FCP website. You'll see across the top of the screen, right there under grants, it lists each type of grant program that we do have. And if each time you click on the type of the grant, you'll go to a page with full information about the given grant. And it's pretty thorough. You would be able to actually preview grant applications, LOI forms, etc. So there's a lot of great information right on our website. If you get started or at any time working through the process of applying for a grant from FCP, we are here and happy to answer your specific questions.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and certainly encourage all of you to take a closer look at that after we hear about from our presenters today and the great information that they have to share with all of you. Today's workshop is part of our FC Present series that we started just in 2022 to allow thought leaders to share their expertise with all of us. And after today's workshop, we have another opportunity for some professional development coming up on March 20th at Bucks County Community College when we welcome Voulay, the founder of Nonprofit AF. And he's coming to Bucks County to talk to us in a 1-hour keynote presentation, and more information on that is as well on our website. A few housekeeping items today. Please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. Pop any questions that you have in the chat. We'll monitor that and make sure we get to your questions at the end of the presentation. We'll have plenty of time for that. And a link of today's recording will be emailed to you in a few days. And we encourage you to use it as an ongoing resource, share it with colleagues. And that email will also include, again, the links to today's slide deck. So you'll have everything in an email by the end of the week. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning presenters. Morgan Bryan is the Manager of Partnership and Grants at the Travis Manion Foundation in Doylestown. She joined FCP's board in 2021 and currently chairs our Program Development Education Committee. Dr. Patricia Smallacombe is the Associate Dean of Academic Partnerships at Bucks County Community College in Newtown. Patty joined our board in 2019 and also serves on the Program Development Education Committee. And if you want more Patty, and who doesn't, she also shares her expertise through a series of workshops at the Grundy Library. So without further ado, Morgan, Patty, take it away. And I will share my screen here momentarily.
Great. Thank you, Toby and Caroline. That was awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Foundations Community Partnerships Annual Grants Workshop. Patty and I are so excited about the turnout today. I think we have a full house that signed up. And so we're looking forward to getting started. This year's workshop is called Grant Writing, Telling Your Organization's Story in 2024. We're so grateful that we have many familiar faces, as well as some new faces on the call today. And so we hope that the information shared here not only helps you as you apply for some of FCP's grant opportunities in the future, but that it translates into other funding opportunities as well. As Toby mentioned, we do ask that for the sake of time, you please hold all questions to the end or put them in the chat. We promise to leave space. I think about 15 minutes is what we planned for questions and feedback. Next slide, please. So as Toby mentioned, today's grants workshop will be presented by myself and my colleague, Dr. Patty Smallacombe. My name is Bryan. I am a member of Foundation's Community Partnerships Board of Directors. I've been on the board for about 3 years now. And I always say to Toby and Caroline, I feel like I've kind of grown up professionally with the organization. I was a previous Summer Youth Corps intern about 8 years ago now, I think. And I definitely credit FCP with sparking my love for the nonprofit sector. I'm also the manager of partnerships and grants at Travis Manion Foundation. We're a locally founded and headquartered national veteran service organization here in Bucks County. And most of what I do at Travis Manion Foundation is centered around grant writing, grant management, supporting both national and regional and local projects. I have a master's degree in nonprofit leadership from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a bachelor's degree in human development and family studies from Penn State University. I also have the privilege of learning from incredible colleagues such as Dr. Patty Smallacombe. So I'll pass it off to her to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Morgan and Toby and Caroline. Good morning, everyone. I'm Patty Smallacombe, also a board member at Foundation's Community Partnership since 2019, as Toby mentioned, and I serve with Morgan on the Program Development and Education Committee. I am the Interim Associate Dean of Academic Partnerships at Bucks County Community College and continue to oversee the grants office there that I personally directed for over 7 years. Okay. I may have met some of you through my years at United Way of Bucks County. I worked with agency staff on outcomes in particular. I'm a sociologist by training, and my focus has been on qualitative and field research. Back to you, Morgan.
Thank you, Patty. You can go to the next slide, please, Toby. So some goals for this workshop. The overarching theme for today's slides is really centered around storytelling. But before we get there, we'll do the following things. Number one, we're going to discover some new trends in grant making and grant writing, how the landscape has changed over the past few years. We're going to learn how to align your grant narrative with your budget and your objectives. And finally, empower funders to support your mission, again, through storytelling. And as those who work in the nonprofit sector, obviously we don't sell products, but we do sell our mission and our impact. And unlike our for-profit counterparts, our impact is really centered around individual people who obviously have very complex issues and lives. So it's really imperative that the support that we inspire from our partners is not just a transaction, but that it's really transformational. And being able to tell that story about your project can help you achieve and sustain that goal. Next slide, please. Patty and I really loved this quote from Jeremy Reese. People aren't giving you money to fund programs, they're donating to see results. When you think about the causes that you support in your community, whether it's a summer camp initiative or a food bank, for example, it's really not about the tangible benefits that come to mind first. It's that intangible, invisible impact. So for example, providing a sense of community and belonging for people, or the implications of families being able to gather at a dinner table and have access to quality, healthy food. It's a sense of security, all the things that are so difficult to quantify and to really place a monetary value on. But we in the nonprofit sector, we know that value, we get to see it every day. So it's all in how we communicate that. And before we jump into storytelling, on the next slide, we're going to discuss some recent trends in grant writing and funder expectations. Okay, there are some components of grant writing, obviously, that remain fundamentally the same. For example, defining your need, how your program meets that need, and what the intended impact of your program or your intervention is. And while Patty is going to dive more deeply into that, into goals and objectives, as well as budget alignment in a little bit, we figured we'd start off by discussing the grants landscape today and how some of the basics of grant writing have shifted slightly, especially since 2020. So since 2020, the nonprofit sector has actually had to get very creative in many respects, as I'm sure you all are very familiar with. When we couldn't meet in person during COVID, for example, many of our programs transformed to a virtual or hybrid implementation. Likewise, many funders then had to forego the traditional in-person site visits, turning to Zoom for virtual visits or Microsoft Teams. Now we're all Zoom experts, and I think it's probably safe to assume that Zoom and Teams meetings are likely the default for your organization. Some funders even shortened their funding cycles, making quicker turnarounds for grant payouts, shortening their applications or offering impact video applications or interview options in place of the traditional proposal. Most funders also recognize the urgency at which nonprofits required funding, not only to stay afloat in many cases and keep the doors open and the lights on, but to meet pressing needs in the community, such as mental health needs. Post-pandemic, much of this creativity is still sticking around. Another example of this related to foundations, community partnership, we recently started doing inflation adjustments to grant awards, which is really, in my opinion, very ahead of the curve and creative. General grants, the pandemic also brought along more general operating funding than we have ever seen before. I think most of us grant writers in the room would also say that we wish there were still more of these general operating opportunities out there. But nonetheless, seeing them increase is a positive development post-pandemic. Funders are really recognizing a need for unrestricted or multi-year support. Trust-based philanthropy is also slowly but surely becoming more common as funders build strong relationships with grantees and don't require as many strict reporting do-outs. There's also an increased focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So yeah, in addition to the pandemic, obviously 2020 was also a time of a huge racial reckoning in our country. And the nonprofit sector has since really stepped up to provide programs and services to help bridge divides in our communities. We're also making internal shifts to promote diversity in our organizations and on our boards, ensuring that we uplift diverse perspectives. Funders are buying in to support DEI policies and initiatives, which is another positive trend in funding and in the impact of the sector. And though you may not hear it as such a hot button topic as it was in 2020, it's very important not to lose momentum in this area and to keep recognizing that DEI has many facets, even outside of race and ethnicity, including ability, gender and sexuality, age, and more. And as the years go on, it becomes increasingly important to hear diverse perspectives in your community and bring your constituents into that conversation. There's also an emphasis on qualitative data, which is really goes back to that storytelling theme for today. More than ever, funders want to hear your story. They want to hear the stories of those that you're serving. They want to see impact videos or photos that accompany your narrative, in addition to the quantitative metrics. Telling your prospective funder how many children you have impacted, for example, is much less effective than telling them about Sally and how her summer in an equine youth therapy program transformed her social skills and her ability to form relationships with her classmates. So really bringing in that human element to your grant proposals is important. And I like to think of it as creative writing in addition to that technical writing. Sustainability, and while there's more general operating support than ever before, most funders want to know that the organization is stable enough to sustain their impact beyond the grant period. I won't get too much into that because Patty's going to discuss that a little bit more later in the presentation, getting into project evaluation and budgets. These next three bullets really emphasize partnerships over transactions. Like in any positive relationship, it's a two-way street. Organizations really need to ensure that their missions align with the funder and make it as easy as possible for the funder to want to buy in to the impact that you're making. For example, what is your funder getting out of the partnership with your organization? How are they engaged with your organization or your project? Are they being recognized appropriately? Likewise, funders are increasingly flexible with regards to what isn't working. They value transparency, they want to see collaborations. Who are you working with in the community to fill gaps in need, and how are you working together to accomplish your goals? And lastly, we wanted to add in artificial intelligence. It's becoming more and more robust and common. We're hearing AI all the time. Many organizations are taking a cautious approach to AI right now as we learn more about the security of various apps and tools. But some are already using it to help phrase their proposals differently, or to even track on the individual donor side what campaigns are resonating with people, and you know, making their strategic plans that way. The more we learn about these tools, the less scary they become. So I definitely encourage everybody to not shy away from it, learn a little bit more about it and how to use it to your advantage at your organization. And I'll hand it over to Patty for a minute to discuss what elements make up a grant.
Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you, Morgan. I just want to do an overview of the three main components: the narrative, the budget, and outcomes that must align to tell a quality story and produce a quality grant proposal or application. Morgan's going to focus on the narrative component in a moment. I want to say a word about the budget and the outcomes. The budget can be seen as a fiscal description of the programmatic elements of your grant project. I may have, Outcomes can be seen as results or impact, and that's also a description of your programmatic elements of your grant project. So budget and outcomes are often seen as separate from the narrative, but I'd like to encourage you to view them as really the other parts that tell your story. Budgets are allocations to personnel, activities, supplies, equipment, consulting, food. They show how your activities will be supported. Many funders are concerned when grantees have not spent any funds in a given fiscal period, as spent funds are seen as evidence of grant activity. And there's some truth to this. Outcomes, goals, and objectives must be the results of change that come from your program intervention. And these must be aligned with that problem statement, that need statement, and the programmatic activities and solution to address that need. An example would be one from my days at United Way. A residential house serving men with substance and mental health issues and helping them gain and maintain steady employment requested funds for psychiatric services as the main grant activity. However, the budget only included a line item to purchase a van. This van was a vital core activity. It was vital to the core activity of the agency, getting the men to their jobs. However, it does not support the request for psychiatric services. And so there was a misalignment between what was requested in the narrative and what that budget line item looked like to support that activity. So Morgan, why don't you go back to narrative and we'll pick up with the outcomes in the budget later on.
Great, sounds good. Thanks, Patty. So we can go to the next slide, Toby. So what goes into your grant narrative? On the next slide, we're going to go into storytelling elements of the narrative, but in short, a grant narrative should be considered really the meat and potatoes of any proposal you're putting together, whereas the budget, your logic model, if there is one required, and or your goals, objectives, and attachments are the sides that make the meal whole. So it should really all complement each other, and you can consider the budget logic model as like supporting materials for that narrative. In the narrative, you'll want to give a history and a background of your organization, really lay it out for the funder, what they need to know and to sort of set the stage for your mission and the projects that help you achieve that mission. This is also where you'll state your need, using real anecdotes from the population that you serve and statistics and research that illustrate the problem you're solving, but more importantly, why the problem needs to be solved. Your statement of need will be the most research and data-driven section of your proposal. For example, if I'm writing a proposal, as I often do for like a youth mentorship program, for example, in Pennsylvania, it'll be important for me to demonstrate that there's not only a need for mentorship programming in PA, but to explain why mentorship is the best route to address this need. So for example, I could use the Pennsylvania Youth Survey or the PAYS data to show that maybe incidences of bullying for 8th graders has risen, or maybe drug and alcohol abuse has risen. And after stating that problem, I'll want to lean into a little bit of research, not too much, but you'll want to throw some statistics in there regarding, obviously, yeah, the current problem and how you aim to solve it. Leaning into research on the preventative nature of mentorship and how having positive mentors for youth decreases the prevalence of antisocial behaviors like those I listed. Oftentimes funders, especially in the behavioral health space, are more motivated to fund programs that have a prevention component to them because the focus is on really building positive behaviors and results moving forward. I heard once that the goal of every nonprofit should really be to eventually no longer be needed. And if we approach our funding in this way, we can empower funders to be part of these impactful long-term shifts rather than short-term solutions or patching up the problem. This really reinforces the stability of our programs. The narrative should also illustrate your team, who is carrying out the project described and what qualifies them to successfully carry it out. It may be less important to discuss your leadership team and more important to showcase the skills and expertise of the programs team on the ground that's directly doing the work that you're talking about. Usually if funders want to learn more about your board or your executive team specifically, they'll state that in the application. But if not, as a general rule, I usually default to discussing our direct programs team involved with the project at hand. You'll also, of course, want to clearly and concisely describe your project, how you define and evaluate success, tying that impact back to your statement of need, and showcasing how the impact made by the funding will be sustained once the grant period runs out. And lastly, but certainly not least, you'll want to illustrate how the funding will be utilized specifically and really walk that funder through the budget that you provide and leave no room for miscommunication. And Patty's going to discuss more about budgets and sustainability in a little bit. But for now, we can go to the next slide. Your grant proposals should really tell a story that begins with your narrative and extends throughout each element of the proposal. And like any good story, the stage needs to be set. Grant proposals should be approached as if your funder has no idea about your mission, even if they do. You could have a longstanding relationship with your funder and you'll still want to make sure that, again, there's no room for miscommunication. It's likely that your primary contact at that organization is not going to be the only one reviewing your proposal. They might not even be reviewing it at all. It might be a board who knows nothing about what you do. So your need statement is really your purpose and the hook that will spark the funder's care for your target population and your project. Ask yourself why, what the story is and why it needs to be told and why it needs to be told now. Why is it an urgent need? What are the costs associated with not fixing the problem? What are the risks? The plot is next. This is your project description. What is your project? How does it address the need? This is your what, your where, and your when. So for example, when does your program meet? How many people will it impact? And what will they be engaging in? The characters are your project leaders, as well as the people you're impacting through the grant project. You'll want to illustrate who leads your project, what qualifies them to do it, who is being served, and most importantly, how is the project or program informed by the population being served? For example, do the people you're serving have a voice in what they need and how their needs are met? Do you make changes and updates based on the experiences of those you're serving? How do you learn about their experiences? Do you send out a survey, for example? And how do you incorporate that feedback? And last but not least, consider your audience. This really sounds like a no-brainer, but truly it isn't. We know our organization so well. It's very easy for us to get lost in the weeds in our passion for our mission and our organization. We think, how could anybody not support this, right? Because we see it every day. Sometimes it's so easy that the mission of the funder or the grant program guidelines can get lost. Grant writers, we spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours every year writing proposals. So make the most of your time by really thoroughly researching your grantors and ensuring that the partnership is mutually beneficial. Next slide, please. So here are some tips to keep in mind when writing your proposal. Be clear and concise. I know we asked a lot of questions on the previous slide, but really trying to break it down into what's the core, again, the meat and potatoes of your grant. You know your organization and your programs inside and out, but the funder doesn't. Even if they do know you well or they have a great relationship, like I said, with your contact there, the review committee might not know you. If you can avoid using acronyms, definitely leave them out. But of course, sometimes it can be unavoidable. We recommend doing your best to concisely explain what the acronym means the first time you use it. So for example, at Travis Manion Foundation, we often refer to ourselves as TMF. Or if I'm writing about our youth development program called Character Does Matter, it's easy to refer to it as CDM. We use so many acronyms where I work. But if I say CDM to someone who has never heard of the program, or even Character Does Matter for that matter, without describing it first, it may have already lost them. They're already thinking about something completely different. So if I describe it as a youth development program, that will resonate a little bit differently. Likewise, you'll want to define your terms. So for example, if you're talking about social emotional well-being, explain what that is. Why does it matter for the adolescents that you're serving? Try to avoid using jargon or complicated language that funders aren't familiar with. On the flip side of that coin, using terms that the funder typically does use on their website, in their mission statement, in the RFP, that's great. I like to think of it as kind of a cover letter. So if you're applying for a job, you're going to want to use words that are in that job description in your cover letter. You'll also want to use person-first language at the center of the people you're serving. So many organizations still use terms like at-risk youth, for example. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that phrase, it does center the issue at hand rather than the humanity of the problem. So instead, we like to try to take our time to put more thought into the language. So in this case, we would usually say youth who are underserved or youth who are more vulnerable to the effects of poverty. And putting that youth piece first really centers that person. Language does evoke feelings. People visualize things when they're reading your grant. So we'll really want to maintain the dignity of the people that we're serving. And of course, oftentimes there's character and word limits, so we want to be conscious of that. These can prevent us from being able to expand our language, but nonetheless, it's still good to be conscious of it. Use your best judgment, and at the very least, try to mirror the language that your prospective funder uses when talking about your population. And lastly, tell stories about your organization that showcase the best of what you do and how you do it. Telling real life stories and giving examples and quotes from participants is much more powerful than presenting basic numbers. Obviously, they work hand in hand, so if you can do a little bit of both, that's always great. Even more of a bonus is including photos of your program or videos which showcase your impact. Many times, online grant applications will have space for other attachments or uploads that are supplemental to your proposal. And a lot of times these are optional, but I would recommend using this opportunity to upload a story, upload photos. Sometimes the file types for these types of things are restricted to Word docs or PDFs, in which case you can add a link to a YouTube video on a Word doc and upload that. There's always these little ways that you can showcase what you're doing in a little bit more of a creative way that might get you recognized and stand out amongst the stack of applications that organizations get. So take advantage of this free space to get creative and really further illustrate your mission and what you do. Next, I will pass the baton over to Patty to go into some more details surrounding goals and objectives, as well as defining impact through program evaluations and budgets.
Thank you, Morgan. I love listening to you talk about grant narratives and so many great tips that you give.
Likewise.
I'd like to take a moment to define some basic but really important terminology and components, excuse me, for the structure of the project that allows for meaningful assessment. A well-planned project is based on the alignment of these particular guideposts. So definition for goals, outcome statements that define what an organization is trying to accomplish, both programmatically and organizationally. Objectives are very precise, time-based, and measurable actions that support the completion of a goal. And outcomes are what changes or results do you expect to see from your program participants, the community, et cetera? So examples would be, a goal would be clients will achieve financial stability. Objectives would be more specific actions as part of the program intervention, that clients will learn about budgeting and credit. They'll develop a family budget. They'll open a savings or checking account. By the end of the program, those clients are out of debt. So this is sort of the flow of what your big goal is and how those objectives help move your clients or your participants in that direction. So this example demonstrates something about outcomes that is helpful to know about. There are short-term outcomes that really reflect changes in knowledge, attitudes. Intermediate outcomes really look at changes or capture changes in behaviors and actions. And long-term outcomes are really a change in someone's status or their condition. So next slide, please. My last example about timeframes leads into this super helpful SMART acronym guiding the drafting of objectives. These are really important concepts that make for strong objectives that align with your goal. So you've probably seen this acronym. Sometimes the different words are defined slightly differently, but SMART outcomes or SMART objectives are actions of a grant that lead to the outcomes demonstrating that that goal has been reached. Objectives lead to results, change, success for program participants or clients. So another example I would give about the time-bound aspect of this, which is more common than you think that proposers make this easy mistake. A time-bound long-term outcome could be in a mentoring program at an elementary school in an economically challenged neighborhood, could be the promotion of those students who are being mentored, those mentees, to the next grade. But the long-term outcome should not be that those students are going to graduate high school. And the reason is that high school graduation is really out of the scope of the timeline of your program intervention. It's correlated with the long-term outcome that students are going to be improving their academic performance based on this mentorship and what they learn from the mentors. But causation is hard to show that far down the line in an individual's life or a community's conditions. So you don't want to set yourself up for not being able to demonstrate that long-term outcome. Something I'd like to add to the consideration of SMART objectives is a really important next step. And that is, in order to implement objectives or actions toward the goal of your project, it's really vital to determine what valid indicators or metrics of information that show change in the outcomes, those changes that have been achieved, and to what extent they've been achieved in the different timeframes of the program. So that's a lot of technical language for how those programmatic interventions are influencing changes in skills and knowledge and attitudes, behaviors, status, and conditions. So I will give you the definition of an indicator here, but I'm not going to go down that outcomes rabbit hole today. If you'd like to learn more about indicators, please feel free to join me for a workshop on outcomes measurement that I'll be giving at the Grundy Library on April 24th from 10 to 12 in Bristol, where I will go into greater depth about outcomes measurement and indicators. Shameless plug, but it is a danger for me in these presentations because I can go right down into the nitty-gritty. But just for what you're taking away today, an indicator is a specific observable and measurable characteristic or change that will represent achievement of an outcome. Could be specific statistics, the number or percent attaining the outcome the program will calculate to summarize its achievement. So let me give you an example of an indicator and a number and percent of that outcome that you've listed. If you're doing a teen parenting program to support those young parents and want to see healthy babies and healthy social emotional development, as Morgan pointed out, One of the indicators that's often used are something called APGAR scores. So the APGAR is a quick test performed on the baby in the first minute and then 5 minutes after the birth to determine how well the baby is tolerating the birth process and then how well the baby's doing out in the world. So the indicators are, and this is the acronym appearance, pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration. And the scoring is a 0, 1, or 2 for each of those indicators. And the score of a 7 to 10 indicates that a baby is healthy and doesn't need more medical attention, particularly for breathing, that sort of thing. Other examples of indicators include number or percent of students in a mentoring program who improve their performance in a class by half a grade, or number of participants attending can show how successful a program is or a project is in recruiting those participants to the program. So that's actually a kind of a short-term outcome because it's right at the beginning just to get your program going, but actually programs need to put some time, attention, and resources to outreach and marketing and that sort of thing. So the number of participants attending could actually be an indicator of success of the program. So next slide, please. All right, a logic model. Morgan referred to this previously, and sometimes it is required from a funder. Excuse me. A logic model is really a picture of your theory of change. So it's your program goals and objectives together that informs your grant project for your organization and for the funders who require one for your application or request for funds. A logic model is a drawing that shows how one thing leads to the next, like a flow chart. Logic models are helpful for a program design because they allow you to build that structure of how program activities, resources, and evaluation actually fit together. So a question would be, how will your program get participants and clients to where they need to go, where you want them to go? And logic models are particularly useful for defining outcomes and indicators within those different timeframes of the program, the short term, the intermediate, the long term. All right, next slide, please. Here is an example of a logic model for a human service program. It has the elements that logic models include, such as goals, objectives, inputs, which are your resources of time and money, usually, activities that are aligned with your SMART objectives, outputs, which are actually things that you count in the implementation of your program, and then outcomes or those changes or results you want to see in your participants' lives as a result of those activities. Logic models sometimes include specifying data sources and methods of data collection, and those are all related to your project. Others can include more aspects to your theory of change, such as that statement of need that Morgan was talking about, or external factors to the program that should be considered when putting together a solution to a need that's been identified in the proposal. So next slide, please. All right, so here's another quote that Morgan and I love from Albert Einstein. Sometimes things that can be counted don't, and sometimes things that can't be counted do. So next slide, please. We like this quote in this particular part of the workshop presentation because it really leads to our discussion about quantitative versus qualitative data. And I told you in my introduction that I'm a qualitative sociologist, which is a slightly different way of defining qualitative than what Morgan was talking about in terms of story narratives, firsthand accounts of people in your world and that are being served by your agency. Qualitative results are based on their methods to collect them consistently, but they're different than larger scale statistics. And statistics are very important in showing the broader picture of the need, or of the achievement of your program. But observations and participant narratives who are telling the story of reaching those goals are also very important. Excuse me. So quantitative measures are often collected by surveys. Sometimes they're self-report or other people reporting for the participants. They're measurements with instruments or specific rubrics like that APGAR score or birth weight for healthy babies. Whereas qualitative data are really structured observations. They're interviews that have consistent questions with each interviewee that you speak with. Focus groups, again, that have very consistent structure so that when you replicate them, you are collecting data in a valid and reliable way. But the qualitative data really serve to, and are really helpful to illuminating how participants have benefited from the project activities, and not just how many or the scale, the success of your program. What's the difference between outcomes and impact? That's another really important distinction that you should note and that you should really get a good understanding of as a key to successful grant project evaluation. While outcomes refer to specific and measurable short-term effects, impact is more comprehensive evaluation of broader and longer-term effects. To assess impact, you'll be asking the question, what does success look like? And I love to use this example of reducing smoking among the general public. When I was growing up, there were commercials for cigarettes. And then there were PSAs for not smoking. Often they were parents and children, and the children telling their parents not to smoke. I broke my mother's cigarettes. It was a time in the 70s. And we started to see tobacco companies produce settlements for class action suits that looked at the impact of smoking on individual health. Insurance companies changed their policies to reflect smoking as a risk factor, and that was being considered in the type of insurance that you got or requirements that you had to live up to get that insurance. And then we saw changes in public health policies. So now American society has smoke-free public places. In fact, it's harder to find a place to smoke than it is to be in a smoke-free space in certain institutions and certain areas in society. So that's a great example of an overall big impact, and how do we know success has occurred? And that's because there are smoke-free places that people can enjoy. Formative versus summative evaluations. This is another concept that I like to point out. It's usually for larger scale, mostly publicly funded grants. It's another important set of definitions and distinctions related to evaluation that I think is helpful to know about. Formative evaluation is typically conducted during the development or improvement of a program. It's really looking at how are we implementing this program and in what ways can we improve the way we deliver our program and how we measure it. Whereas summative evaluation involves making assessments about the efficacy of the program or how participants' lives are actually changed and by how much, measured by outcomes. So the formative, again, is about how are we conducting this program and how can we better deliver it and evaluate it. And summative are really those outcomes results that show the participants' lives are changing. All right, so we're going to leave outcomes. If we could have the next slide. Bear with me for one more area, which is grant budgets, and then I'll turn it back over to Morgan. As I mentioned before, the grant budget is a fiscal description of the programmatic elements of your grant project. It must be in alignment with those grant activities you want to accomplish and the outcomes or changes that you want to see benefiting grant project participants or clients. So remember my previous example. Don't put the cost of a van in for a project that has a goal of providing psychiatric services to clients. Instead, a more appropriate line item for that grant project could have been a budget line item of consultants So in this case, it would be psychiatrists who will be compensated specifically for a defined number of hours dedicated to providing care for those clients. So that would be more in alignment with the program request. Here's some questions to ask yourself and your team when putting together a grant project budget. So about participants, what is the cost of recruitment? As I talked about before, that's an activity, that's an initial activity, and it requires resources. So it includes marketing and outreach costs. Sometimes there is a line item for marketing. Other times it's really, you have to put that into the other line item and get it in as an important cost to bringing participants into your program. The travel line item. So who is traveling and for what purpose? Is it staff traveling? Are you trying to move students from one place to another? Are you going to conferences? Often that's important for public agency grants, that the project director or the principal investigator actually has to go to an annual conference with the agency. Other line items can be for consultants, as I pointed out with these psychiatrists. These consultants are usually providing professional expertise, and they're paid differently than the staff, which is often called personnel. So often in grants, these big public grants, you would bring in evaluation consultants who would do your external evaluation, and they might be written into an other line or a consultant line. And of course, food. We all like to include food. If you have food, your participants will come. But it's important when you put in a line item for food that it's tied into supporting those participant costs, rather than just, we're going to have a movie night and it's going to be fun to have food, although that could actually be an activity of the grant as well. But more and more funders are a little bit more specific about what kind of food is allowable, or what food costs are allowable in a project. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about a few other concepts having to do with budgets. I've been talking a lot about public grants and large ones for those of you who are pursuing those. There's the ability to capture administrative overhead, and that's very important in a big grant project. It allows your organization to capture operating costs for accounting, for payroll, for an audit that has to be produced. These are often called indirect costs or administrative overhead, or sometimes administration and facility. So bigger organizations, say the community college, has something called a negotiated indirect cost rate with a federal agency. We do this with the Federal Human Services Agency. And that's a particular indirect cost rate that we apply to our public grants. In our case, it's only covers salaries and benefits, and a percentage of those, because those are our biggest costs in grants. If an organization hasn't pursued this negotiated indirect cost rate, and don't panic if you don't have one, there's often the possibility of taking 10% for administrative costs. They call this the 10% de minimis rate. And as I said, these indirect cost line items are typically only available in the bigger publicly funded grants on the federal, state, or even local governmental level of agencies. So if you have more questions about this, we can talk about this at the end, or feel free to contact me. I think more generally covered is this question about sustainability. And I learned this actually while working with a lot of grants at United Way, that sustainability does not mean that you have to replicate your particular project and the salary of that staff or those staff who are working on the project. We often think we just have to keep this going. How are we going to find a funder who's going to keep that same program and those same staff in place? Sustainability really can mean that your project has been achieved in most of its parts, and it's been built into your organizational budget, or it's been picked up by other partners who take on your work. You can continue a meaningful component that still needs funding, whereas the other components are sort of taken care of. And I think that once you free yourself to think about sustainability that way, it's a lot easier, that it doesn't have to be everything as it was with the same amount of money. You can pick up a particular component and find a creative way to sustain it. I also wanted to mention fiscal reporting. Fiscal reporting is another way to show your funder how your program and project activities are being implemented. As I mentioned that if you haven't spent your money in the first quarter, the funder's going to wonder what's going on. Are there delays? What's happening? Fiscal reporting is often required, again, for publicly funded grants. It could be quarterly, twice a year, certainly annually. And most governmental agencies allow a grant recipient to move funds between line items without seeking permission or having to do a formal amendment to your budget. And usually that's within 10 or 15% of the total budget, depends on the funder. For foundations, for private funders, it's possible to shift your money probably with less oversight by the funder. However, I will talk in a minute about a best practice in that area. Sometimes line items can't be changed. For the National Science Foundation, for example, participant support cannot be changed without a very formal amendment. And I want to emphasize that proposed budgets are just that. When you are writing an application or a proposal, you're proposing a budget. There's often a need to change something in your budget that reflects what's actually happening in your grant project as you implement it. And funders understand that. So an example might be that there might be a need for additional staff time if there are more than expected participants or clients who are involved in the program. And there's a particular ratio, staff-client ratio, that has to be maintained. So you might need to move more money over to increase your staffing levels and take that away from an area that you can afford perhaps to not have as much resource to fund. When do you contact a funder about your budget, whether it's a public agency or it's a private foundation or it's FCP? When you're making significant shifts in activity, performance period, or the type of expenditure, for example, you're using consultants instead of your own staff who are personnel to be the key staff. This is a case where a private foundation grant as well as public agency grant funder should be contacted. I really err on the side of communicating with the funder. I know that FCP really appreciates this, that if you have some question about moving money around in your budget, talk to your funder about it. They appreciate knowing they might have some good suggestions, and you are maintaining that transparency that Morgan was talking about, which is really a best practice as a grantee. If you have more questions about grant budgets, please feel free to ask me after we conclude the presentation. So now, going to go back to Morgan.
Thank you, Patty. That was great. So we're going to go into a little bit about Foundation's Community Partnerships grant review process. As Caroline noted earlier, Foundation's Community Partnership offers several different grant opportunities. And while we don't have time to get into all the details of all the opportunities today, please visit our website. Again, the website will be listed on the next couple slides. So you're looking at 2 members of the board of directors at Foundation's Community Partnership. We are the ones who review the grant proposals and oversee that process. We do look for several key criteria, many of which we have already talked about here today, but some of these are listed on this slide. So collaboration, sustainability, budget clarity, and mission alignment are all extremely important. We want to ensure that the projects that we fund are having a positive impact on the behavioral health and human service needs of Bucks County children, young adults, and families, as stated in our mission. We also look for projects that have maximum impact on Bucks County residents and projects that are sustainable long-term, many of the buzzwords we've used. Projects that include collaborations with other organizations impacting Bucks County residents are especially appealing, as they often inspire greater innovation and have more sustained or broader impact. And lastly, we will look for budgets that clearly outline how FCP's funding will be used and which line items specifically will be impacted by the grant. So, for example, if you have an overview of your project budget, a lot of times this looks like adding an extra column that shows specifically your ask to FCP through the grant, and then which of those line items that pertains to and how much for each. That's not to say, again, like Patty said, these things can't change. Again, it's a proposed budget, but that gives us a better sense of exactly where the funding is going. And we do offer general target funding opportunities as well. In addition, we now offer brief in-person meetings as part of our Partnership and Youth Services grant review process. This is a really nice way for our board members to get to know organizations that are new to FCP and to provide grantees an opportunity to really tell their story face to face. We started this last year, and it's been fantastic to get to know all of the awesome newer organizations in Bucks County doing incredible work. So if you're an organization that's new to FCP, please keep an eye out for our Partnership and Youth Services grants if you serve youth. The next cycle will be taking place in August. And then for specific questions regarding grant guidelines and specific funding opportunities through FCP, we encourage you to visit our website at fcpartnership.org. From there, like Caroline showed you earlier, we have a grants tab that gives a very comprehensive overview of the funding process. It even has the guidelines and kind of the rubric, the criteria that we look for. And before we let you go for the day, we wanted to also offer you some of our recommended resources on the next slide for continued education and assistance. So in addition to the grants tab on FCP's website, there is also a resources tab. And this includes recordings of some engaging conversations with nonprofit leaders and experts in the field, as well as some information on our key partners. I also highly recommend subscribing to some newsletters such as Chronicle of Philanthropy, Nonprofit Times, and American Philanthropic. There's a lot of great content here, not only for grant writers and those on your partnerships team, but for those on the individual giving side as well, and really anyone in your organization. We've also listed a couple awesome podcasts that have brief but impactful episodes with the latest fundraising news and information. So if you want to dive into topics like AI, for example, there's some really good content in there. They're brief, like 20-30-minute episodes, and very digestible content that's fun to listen to. And before I hand it over to Patty one last time, if anyone's looking for a digital grant management and grant research platform, I always highly recommend Instrumental as a tool. I've been using this at my organization for several years now, and it's extremely helpful. Not sponsored. If you're interested in trying a free month of the subscription, please feel free to reach out to me. My email will be on the next slide. And I have a referral code for you that'll give you 1 month free if you want to try it out. And I'll hand it over to Patty to talk a little bit about the Nonprofit Center.
Thanks so much, Morgan. So there are 2 nonprofit centers that we wanted to highlight for you today. One is the Nonprofit Center at LaSalle University. It's the LaSalle Nonprofit Center, as it's referred to often, has been at the forefront of helping organizations in the greater Philadelphia region for around 40 years. And they work in partnership with nonprofit executive directors, nonprofit staff and volunteers, boards of directors. They also work with businesses that value corporate responsibility and the role nonprofits play in our community. LaSalle Nonprofit Center's diverse integrated services are in the areas of nonprofit education, consulting, and leadership development, and they're rooted in best practices. They offer master's degrees or certificates in nonprofit management. And one of the really great benefits of FCP is we've helped support our leading executive directors and other staff in the county and our nonprofit organizations to achieve that educational level and really infuse their own leadership with the many things they learn in these programs. LaSalle Nonprofit does value-added consulting, leadership advancement, so focus on board governance training. And the other thing, which is they used to have a newsletter for nonprofit jobs, and I don't know if they still do that, but I did find something called foundationlist.org, which is a place where you can post nonprofit jobs or apply for them, jobs that are in the nonprofit sector. So LaSalle is a really amazing resource. Another one, which I've made a shameful plug for, is the Grundy Library Nonprofit Center down in Bristol. Beautiful library that's on the river down in Bristol. It's a nonprofit resource center, and it's part of a funding information network that partners with Foundation Center. As a network partner, this nonprofit resource center provides visitors with free public access to grantmaker directories, books on fundraising, proposal writing they help with, and nonprofit management, as well as access to the electronic database that Foundation Center runs. It's online. It's either the professional or the individual versions, and they're only available to be used at the Grundy Library, either through Grundy's computers or some access that they give you through the library's public Wi-Fi. So Grundy Library's Nonprofit Center helps with proposal writing, nonprofit law and governments, starting a nonprofit. There are workshops like the one that I'm going to be giving in April. They help with fundraising and prospect research, which is really important to have, if you're starting out, to have someone show you how to prospect. And they also help guide you to look for funding for education. So that is the conclusion of our resources and our presentation. And now we'd like to open it up for questions.
Let me take this off of share so we can see everybody. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing this important information and making sure that whether this is brand new to you or serves as a good reminder of good grant making practice, as a grant maker, some of the things that certainly stood out to me, and just wanted to reinforce from the perspective of FCP, AI is really becoming more and more of a hot topic for grant makers, and I think you will find with the organizations that you work with, some are pro AI. They don't mind if you're using AI to complete grant applications, and others are very much opposed to this at this point. I think that opposition is probably likely going to go away, because it's hard to imagine that things are not going to adjust some way, somehow, to a more AI-powered society. I would expect whatever tools that you use, or the grant making tools that you are subjected to in terms of filling out the application, just like higher education, I wouldn't be surprised we start seeing some AI screening tools in some of those online platforms pretty soon, if not already. So just kind of, keep that in mind, and depending on the funder that you're working with, whether that is not a problem or, something that they don't like to see. And the other thing that Morgan and Patty talked about is the engagement. So for us as a grant maker, we love hearing from you. We love being invited out to see your programs, to meet your program staff, your leadership team, your board members. So if that's not to say you need to contact us every single week and say, hey, come on by. But if there are certain things that you are thinking about applying to, and you want to show off that program before you submit an application, or after you submit an application, there's an opportunity to kind of see this in action. We love that. We love to come see that. We tend to always invite board members to those opportunities as well, because as Morgan and Patty said, they're the ones reviewing the applications and making the funding decisions. So the more we can get board members out, the better. We tend to engage all of our board members in volunteer opportunities. So if you can think of a volunteer opportunity that may be appropriate for a larger group, and a funder that you want to kind of work with and get to know a little bit better, reach out to them and invite them to be part of your mission, and meet and greet some of those individuals. And then the one last thing I wanted to mention about FCP, and Morgan and Patty mentioned that too, when it comes to allocating for your salary and benefits. We had a really good conversation that's about 2 years ago now, where we talked about allocating funds towards salary and benefits within our grant applications. And, I think each funder is a little bit different, but, our board made the decision that you can allocate with us up to a third of your ask amount to salary and benefits for each grant application. Recognizing obviously that people have to do, in most cases, have to do the work. So by not allowing that, it would kind of be a little unrealistic from our standpoint, not recognizing obviously the need for people to do that. And, so many times you're already allocating certain times to different projects. So, for us, it was a great way to recognize that it's not just always stuff that you need, it's sometimes the people power, and that also needs to be compensated within your grant application. So when you fill out an application for us, that is part of the opportunity within your budget to allocate up to a third of your ask amount to salaries and benefits, no question asked, and you can move forward in the application. So since we are a smaller group, certainly take yourself off mute if you have a question for Morgan and Patty. We still have a few minutes here, so feel free to ask any specifics regarding their presentation or a project that you're thinking about.
Good morning. I have a question. Hi, so my name is Arthur. I'm a grant coordinator at Project Home in Philadelphia. This could be a question for Morgan or Patty. I'm curious about advice on writing grant proposals for proposed projects versus to support active projects, or more like general operating, what we're already doing. Do you have any advice on how to approach those different kinds of proposals?
Morgan, do you want to start, or do you want me to?
I'll let you go take that first.
I just had a thought. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Arthur. It really depends on the funder. There are some funders that really like to do pilot projects or seed money for that new, that proposed project. And others that are very specific to say, we need to fund a project that's already going, that needs to be scaled, or serving a different population or something like that. So the advice really is to do your prospecting and research a lot of different funders to see which funding organization is in that space to do the pilot projects. They're out there, and some prefer that. Then you'd really have to have a very robust section on sustainability and how you plan to keep that going.
Yeah, I completely agree with Patty. I would say, our organization, we have a broad youth mentorship program where veterans mentor youth, and we're trying to branch that out into like summer camps. And what does that look like? But we don't have anyone that solely funds summer camps because we've never done it before. But I think it's important to showcase what you've already done and been successful with doing, and kind of use that as leverage. Like every project starts off as new at some point, and needs that seed funding to get going. So if you can showcase a project, even if it's not directly related to this new project that you've done and that has been successful, I think that, and just being transparent with the funder that you're talking to and saying, look, this is new, we're going to try this out, and we'd really love to get support on the ground to help us grow this. And we'll be transparent with you throughout the process with what works and what doesn't, and really just laying it out like that. And if you can try to get a phone call or a face-to-face meeting with them ahead of applying, I think that goes a really long way.
Yeah, I just add, Arthur, and good question from the funder's perspective. I think that kind of goes back to the relationship building part of the whole process. So I think the sooner you can start letting potential funders know of this project, whatever it might be, the better. And I think most are going to be pretty transparent whether or not that's going to work for them or not. But I think if they can, as Patty was mentioning, if they can be part of a longer term plan and be kind of an initial investor in that vision. Some get really excited about that. So I think the sooner you can start that conversation with a funder, the better. And I think you're going to get pretty quick and honest feedback whether or not this is going to work for them or not.
Thank you.
Go ahead. I think somebody was saying something. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody. See, Darletta has just right-sized herself. Darletta, you're still on mute. Or maybe she's just shouting at the camera. I don't know.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Lizzie.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm the executive director of the Barn Nature Center in Doylestown. And for so long we've supported ourselves by just running programs, and we only actually just applied for a grant with you guys for the spring. And yeah, it's my first time getting into grants, so all those resources that you guys provided, like instrumental, would that be a good place to search for more grant opportunities? Or the Grundy Library? Like, where do I go to find ones for us, I guess, is what I'm wondering.
I love instrumental, and if you want to shoot me an email after this, I can send you that referral code for the 1 free month. But it allows you to make projects and plug in if there's a geographic scope, obviously Doylestown, and some keywords. It'll actually do prospecting for you on the back end and send you an email with opportunities. So I really love that, especially with being a national organization, having a bunch of regions. It kind of looks for opportunities that are local in everywhere that we are. So I love that. Google searches a lot of times are great. Google Alerts sometimes too, if you plug in grant and some keywords that you have, and that'll also send you an overview once a day or once a week, whatever you want it to be, with alerts. I don't know, Patty, do you have any other prospecting tips?
Yeah, I think it's worth a visit to go down to Grundy, and Grundy in particular, because the staff really are there to guide you. I'm not sure if you have to make an appointment. You might want to call and find out. And take a look at that Foundation Center database and see if that's something that's useful for you. I didn't know that Instrumental actually did prospecting. That's amazing. So that's a wonderful tool. But I think it's worth having a conversation when you're starting out with grant writing with a nonprofit center staff member, and just seeing what's out there and getting some guidance. I think that would be worth your time. It's also very pretty.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Lizzie, and we're looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks, talking about your project. But wanted to, since we're reaching time here, wanted to thank everybody again for attending this workshop. Special thanks to Morgan and Patty for sharing their expertise, and free of charge, so even better. And we look forward to working with many of you, or certainly pursue other grant opportunities that are out there that are appropriate for your organization. But certainly always keep FCP in mind. Keep us posted, and if there are opportunities for us to partner with you and support your efforts, we're always happy to have a conversation. So don't hesitate to reach out. But that being said, have a wonderful rest of your day. As a reminder, you'll be getting a recording of this, as well as the slide deck as well. So if you want to share that or just refresh your memory down the road, you are able to do that. But thank you again, and have a great rest of your day. Great seeing everybody.